The chamber stretched so vast that Earth's largest stadiums would fit inside it 3 times over and still leave room for gardens between them. Ambassador Sarah Chen thought as she walked toward the speaking platform at its center, where representatives from 200 worlds waited to judge her species. Once again the crystalline Vexhari caught the light from a dozen suns streaming through the dome above and scattered it into rainbows that danced across the marble floors while the Mindari sat in their meditation spheres with eyes closed and minds open to thoughts that humans could never hear, and the Kroloth warriors stood at attention with their forearms crossed in what Chin had learned meant contempt among their kind. She took her place at the human podium, which stood noticeably lower than the others, because Earth had not earned what the Council called full technological parity and therefore did not deserve the same height as species who had mastered faster than light, travel or energy manipulation, or any of the other powers that made humanity look like children playing with sticks and stones. High Arbiter Velshan rose from the central seat, and his crystalline body chimed like 1,000 bells as facets shifted to focus attention on the human below, and when he spoke his voice came from everywhere at once because the Vexhari had no mouths and instead vibrated the very air around them to create sound. The Council acknowledges Ambassador Chen of Terra, Velshan announced, and the formal words could not hide the dismissive tone that resonated through the chamber like an afterthought. Why? Given to an unwanted guest at a feast of King's Chun, bowed her head slightly because diplomatic protocol demanded it, but she did not lower her eyes because she would not give them that satisfaction. After 300 years of this treatment, the Terran question must be resolved. Velshan continued, and his words brought murmurs of agreement from delegates who had debated this same topic at least once every standard year since humans had first achieved basic spaceflight and stumbled into a galaxy that had been watching Earth like scientists might watch bacteria in a dish war. Prime Kroloth stepped forward without waiting for recognition because the warrior species followed. Strength, not procedure, in his massive form made even the elevated platform seem small as he glared down at Chen with all 6 of his black eyes. 3 centuries we have waited for the humans to evolve beyond their primitive state. Kraloth growled, and his translator converted the subsonic rumbles into words that made the platforms vibrate beneath everyone's feet. They have no faster-than-light capability, and they cannot manipulate quantum fields, and they possess no psionic potential worth measuring. And yet they refused the Council's generous offer of supervised development. Mindari named Asara opened her large violet eyes, and when she spoke her voice carried the musical quality that all telepaths seem to develop from hearing thoughts as melody rather than noise. The humans cling to their independence like children refusing to admit they need guidance, Asara said, and her words felt soft but cut deeper than Kroloth's aggression ever could. They insist on developing their own technology at their own pace, and they reject our offers to share the secrets that would elevate them to true civilization, and one must wonder if pride has made them incapable of recognizing their own limitations. Chen had heard these arguments so many times. She could recite them in her sleep, and she had prepared responses that mixed diplomacy with subtle defiance in the way that kept Earth from being completely dismissed while not provoking the Council into taking direct action against her world. The people of Earth appreciate the Council's continued interest in our development, Chen began, and she kept her voice steady despite the anger that wanted to sharpen her words into weapons. However, we have chosen a path of self-reliance that has served our species well throughout our history, and we believe that accepting shortcuts to advancement would weaken the foundation of innovation. An adaptation that defines humanity. Velshan's crystalline form pulsed with colors that Chen's briefing materials said indicated impatience, or perhaps amusement at something the Vexhari found absurdly foolish. Self-reliance, Velshan repeated, and the word echoed through the chamber as if he were testing its weight and finding it wanting. The Council has observed Terra for millennia, and we have watched your species struggle with disease and war and environmental collapse while we could have prevented all of it with simple interventions that any first-year student at our academies could implement. And yet you call this suffering self-reliance as if pain were a virtue. The other delegates made sounds of agreement, and Chen saw the Ythrian ambassador flutter its crystalline wings in what that species used as applause, while the Barathians clicked their mandibles in a rhythm that signified approval of Velshan's Statement. Chan straightened her spine and looked directly at the High Arbiter, even though humans were supposed to avert their eyes from those of higher station within the Council's hierarchy. We call it experience, Chen said, and her voice carried farther than it should have in the enormous chamber, because she had learned to project without shouting during her years of being talked down to by beings who thought size and power equaled wisdom. Every challenge we have overcome without assistance has taught us lessons that cannot be learned through gifts given by those who have already solved the problems, and perhaps that is why Earth continues to surprise the Council with innovations in artificial intelligence and medical nanotechnology and industrial efficiency, despite our lack of what you call true civilization? Krolith slammed one of his 4 fists against his platform, and the boom silenced the murmurs that had started to spread through the chamber. Surprised, the War Prime snarled, and his translator barely kept pace with the rapid-fire aggression in his tone. You mean annoyance at a species that wastes the Council's time with stubborn refusal to accept the natural order? Where the strong guide the weak and the advanced uplift, the primitive and the many work together? Under unified leadership before? Chen could respond to what was clearly a threat disguised as philosophy. The chamber's sensor array began emitting a low-frequency warning tone that made several delegates look up in confusion, because such alerts were reserved for significant spatial anomalies or approaching vessels that had not requested permission to enter. Council Space A technician's voice interrupted the proceedings with an urgency that broke every rule of protocol. Arbiter, we are detecting unusual energy signatures at grid reference 77 Alpha. The technician reported, and Chen could hear the confusion in words spoken too quickly. The readings do not match any known propulsion system or natural phenomenon, and they appear to be moving toward galactic core regions at speeds that exceed our measurement capabilities. Velshan's form flickered through colors that indicated annoyance at the interruption before settling into a pattern that Chen had learned meant he was dismissing something as unimportant, likely a sensor malfunction or perhaps a data corruption in the long-range array. The High Arbiter said, and his tone made it clear he considered the matter closed. We will investigate after the Council concludes its current business. The technician hesitated in a way that suggested he wanted to argue but knew better than to contradict the High Arbiter. During a formal session, and the warning tones ceased as someone muted the alert's Rematalikroloth, turned his attention back to Chen, and his expression promised that the interruption had only delayed what he clearly saw as an inevitable confrontation. The Council grows tired of Terran obstinacy, Kroloth said, and the threat was no longer disguised by philosophy or diplomatic language. Perhaps it is time to vote on mandatory integration where Earth accepts Council oversight and human development proceeds under proper supervision, or else Terra faces quarantine as a contaminated zone that might spread its dysfunction to other developing species. Chen felt her heart racing, but she kept her expression neutral as she prepared to deliver the warning she had been authorized to give only if the Council pushed too far toward direct intervention. The Council should understand that Earth's history contains gaps that even we do not fully comprehend, Chen said, and she watched their reactions carefully as she continued. There are periods where our civilization collapsed and rebuilt itself, and we have found evidence of events and technologies that do not match our current understanding of human development, and perhaps the Council's certainty about Terra's primitive nature is based on incomplete information about what humanity has been and what we might still become. Dasara's eyes narrowed, and the Mindari telepath tilted her head in a gesture that Chen had learned meant she was trying to read surface thoughts, but finding resistance. You speak in riddles, Ambassador Chen, Dasara said, and her musical voice carried an edge of frustration. What gaps could possibly change the fundamental reality that humans are technologically inferior and culturally isolated and strategically irrelevant to galactic affairs? Chen allowed herself a small smile that did not reach her eyes as she delivered her final words before the session would inevitably adjourn. You don't know our history, Chen said quietly, but with absolute conviction. You don't know what we lost. The first colony to go dark was Threshold Station, which orbited a mining world in the Outer Reach territories where 3 different species had established processing facilities to extract rare elements from the planet's unusually dense core. And when the communication blackout began, the other colonies assumed it was nothing more than another equipment failure in systems that had been installed by the lowest. Bitterbutt, then Threshold Station's neighbors, stopped transmitting as well. And within 6 standard cycles, an entire sector had fallen silent in a pattern that looked too deliberate to be mechanical failure and too widespread to be explained by natural phenomena like solar flares or magnetic storms. The Galactic Council's Emergency Response Committee convened in a smaller chamber than the Grand Hall, where they conducted formal sessions, but the tension in the room felt heavier than any debate about human stubbornness or trade agreements between Allied Worlds. Commander Zixtar of the Council Defense Fleet stood before a holographic display showing the affected region as a spreading dark zone that consumed star systems. Like ink bleeding across paper 17, colonies have ceased all communication. Zixtar reported, and the reptilian commander's scales had shifted to the gray color that his species displayed when confronting something that defied their understanding. We have sent probe drones into 3 of the affected systems, and 2 were destroyed immediately upon crossing the boundary, while the 3rd transmitted partial data before going offline. Velshan studied the holographic map with an intensity that made his crystalline body pulse with colors that indicated deep concern rather than his usual dismissive arrogance. What did the surviving probe record before its destruction? The High Arbiter asked, and his voice no longer carried the musical quality that made his species famous for their aesthetic appreciation of Soundjixthar. Manipulated the controls, and the hologram shifted to show grainy footage of something massive moving through space near Threshold Station, where the colony's lights had gone completely dark. The ship, if it could be called a ship, looked nothing like the sleek vessels that Council species built with their understanding of quantum mechanics and energy manipulation, and instead resembled something ancient and brutal, like a weapon forged all before civilization had learned to hide violence behind elegant design. Its hull appeared to be made from a black material that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, and structures jutted from its surface in patterns that seemed random but created an overall impression of predatory intent, like teeth arranged in a mouth that existed in too many dimensions. The probe's sensors could not determine the ship's size because it seemed to exist partially outside normal space. Zixtar continued, and his voice carried the strain of someone reporting impossible data that contradicted everything he had been trained to understand. Energy readings fluctuated between 0 and levels that would require harnessing the output of multiple stars, and the whole composition does not match any known element or alloy in the Council's database's War Prime. Kroloth leaned forward in his seat, and for once the aggressive warrior looked troubled rather than eager for confrontation. Did the probe detect life signs or identify the species operating this vessel? Kroloth asked, and his 4 hands had unconsciously formed fists as if preparing for a fight, even though the enemy was light years away. The hologram flickered in audio, began to play over the chamber's speakers, and what emerged was not the usual hails or demands that accompanied military encounters, but instead a voice that spoke in a language that the Council's translation systems struggled to process. The voice sounded both mechanical and organic, as if something that was partly machine and partly alive was forcing words through a medium not designed for speech. And when the translators finally rendered meaning from the sounds, every delegate in the room felt a chill that their species' evolutionary history had taught them to associate with apex predators. Where are my wards? The voice repeated 3 times in what the system identified as ancient Earth language, specifically a dialect that predated modern human civilization by thousands of years. Sarah stood so quickly that her meditation sphere nearly toppled, and her violet eyes had gone wide with an emotion that telepaths rarely showed because they could usually sense danger before it arrived. That language, Thesora said, and her musical voice had become discordant with fear. The translation matrix identifies it as originating from Terra, but the linguistic patterns suggest it is older than human space travel, and older than human written records, and perhaps older than human civilization itself. Velshan turned to look at the Mindari representative in his crystalline form. It shifted to a dark blue that indicated he was processing information, that challenged his fundamental understanding of reality. Possible, the High Arbiter said, but the word lacked conviction. Humans are barely 300 years into space travel, and their oldest historical records extend back perhaps 10,000 standard years at most, and they have no connection to any ancient civilization that possessed this level of technology. Ambassador Chen had been invited to the emergency session despite the Council's usual policy of excluding non-member species from defense matters, and she sat quietly in an observer's seat while the delegates tried to make a sense of data that contradicted everything they thought they knew about the galaxy's history. Isaac Thar continued his report because military officers understood that confusion was not an excuse to stop gathering information. After broadcasting its message, the unknown vessel destroyed Threshold Station and 2 neighboring facilities. Using weapons that appear to manipulate space-time directly, the commander said, and his scales had now turned. Completely gray survivors from an escape pod reported that the station's shields, which were rated to withstand sustained bombardment from Council warships, collapsed in seconds as if they were not present at all. Krolith slammed his fist against the table, and the boom echoed through the chamber. As the War Prime made a decision that his species, warrior culture, demanded, the Kroloth Empire will send a battle fleet to investigate and eliminate this threat, Kroloth announced, and his voice carried the absolute confidence that came from leading a species that had never lost a war. Whatever ancient derelict ship is destroying colonies, it will learn that the modern galaxy is defended by those who have mastered combat across every domain. Velshan opened his crystalline mouth to object, but Krolath had already activated his communication device to relay orders to his fleet commanders, and within hours, 12 Krolath warships departed for the Outer Reach territories with weapons charged and warriors eager to prove themselves against an enemy that had dared to attack Council-protected space. The results came back faster than anyone expected, and in a form that shattered the Kraloth reputation for invincibility that had been built over 10,000 years of conquest and expansion only. 1 escape pod survived the encounter, and the warrior who emerged from it had lost 2 of his 4 arms and seemed to have aged decades in the hours since the battle began. The warrior's report played through the Council chamber 3 days after Kroloth's fleet had departed, and every delegate listened in silence as the survivor described something that defied belief. "We engaged the enemy vessel at maximum range with quantum torpedoes and rail-accelerated warheads," the warrior said, and his voice carried none of the usual Kroloth pride. "The weapons passed through the ship's hull without detonating, as if they had been fired at empty space, and then the ship responded." The warrior paused, and his remaining hands trembled as he continued. "Did not fire weapons," he said. "It simply existed near us, and our ships began to tear apart as if reality itself was rejecting their presence, and I watched the flagship fold into dimensions that should not exist while the crew screamed in languages I have never heard, and when I activated my escape pod, the entity broadcast another message. The recording included audio of the same ancient Earth language, but this time the translation matrix had processed enough data to render the words more clearly. "Where are my wards?" the voice repeated. "I have searched the dark between stars, and I have slept through ages uncounted, and now I wake to find my charges absent, and my purpose unclear, and those who occupy what was once protected space will answer for what has been lost, or they will be removed." The chamber fell into absolute silence as the recording ended. And then every delegate began speaking at once, with voices raised in fear and confusion and demands for explanations that no one could provide. Ambassador Chen remained seated in quiet while the Council descended into chaos around her, and when Velshan finally restored order by flooding the room with a harmonic tone that forced everyone to stop talking, the High Arbiter turned to face the human representative with an expression that crystalline beings used to show desperate need. "Ambassador Chen," Velshan said, and for the first time since humans had joined the galactic community, his voice carried no condescension or dismissal. "Your earlier statements suggested that Earth's history contains gaps, and that humanity has lost knowledge of past events, and this entity speaks ancient Terran language and seeks something it calls wards, and the Council requires immediate access to all human historical records and archaeological data and cultural archives." Dr. James Okonkwo had spent 15 years excavating sites in Antarctica, where ice cores revealed anomalies that should not exist in Earth's geological record, and where ground-penetrating radar detected structures buried under kilometers of frozen water that predated human architecture by thousands of years, and where every discovery raised questions that the academic establishment dismissed as contamination or misinterpretation of natural formations. Now, those same academics who had denied his funding requests and rejected his papers stood in the observation gallery of Luna Research Station 12, while Okonkwo prepared to present findings that Earth's government had classified as ultra-secret until the Council's emergency session had forced humanity to reveal what they had been hiding in frozen tombs beneath the ice. Ambassador Chen stood beside Velshan and Thessera and Warprime Kroloth as Okonkwo activated the holographic display that would show them images recovered from data crystals found in what he called the archive chamber 3 kilometers below the Antarctic surface. Before I begin, I need the Council to understand that what you are about to see contradicts everything humanity thought we knew about our own history, Okonkwo said, and his voice carried the excitement of a researcher finally allowed to share discoveries that had been dismissed as impossible. The silence that Ambassador Chen mentioned was not simply a collapse of civilization, but rather the aftermath of something so catastrophic that it erased nearly all records of what came before the holographic display flickered to life and showed images of Earth as it had appeared 10,000 years ago, but not the primitive agricultural societies that human archaeologists expected to find from that era instead. The images showed cities that reached into the sky with architecture that blended organic and technological elements in ways that modern engineering could not replicate, and transportation networks that moved between continents in minutes rather than hours. And most shocking of all, humans living alongside something that was clearly not human at all. The uncanny entity appeared in dozens of images and recordings. In each time it looked slightly different, as if it could not decide on a single form, or perhaps existed in multiple states simultaneously. Sometimes it appeared as a massive humanoid figure made of light and energy that walked among humans who showed no fear of its presence. Sometimes it manifested as a geometric pattern that floated above cities like a second sun that provided both illumination and protection. Sometimes it took the shape of something that resembled the black ship that had destroyed the Council's fleets, but smaller and more refined, as if the current vessel was a crude approximation of what it had once been. We call it the Sentinel in our translated records, but the ancient humans who lived alongside it used many names. Okonkwo explained as he cycled through images that showed the entity interacting with humans in what appeared to be ordinary daily activities: the Guardian, when it protected them from threats, and the Companion, when it shared knowledge, and the Witness, when it observed their development without interference. Velshan's crystalline form had gone completely still as he processed images that suggested humanity had achieved technological parity with Council species thousands of years before they developed spaceflight. This cannot be accurate, the High Arbiter said, but his voice lacked the certainty that usually characterized his pronouncements. If ancient humans possessed this level of advancement, then evidence would exist beyond a single archive, and other species would have encountered remnants of Terran civilization during their own development. Okonkwo smiled grimly and advanced the presentation to images that answered Velshan's objection in the most horrifying way possible. New recordings showed space battles on a scale that dwarfed anything the Council had ever witnessed, with fleets numbering in the millions, engaging across multiple star systems while weapons tore holes in reality itself and civilizations burned. On hundreds of worlds, the evidence was destroyed, Okonkwo said quietly. Not by humans and not by the Sentinel, but by an enemy that the ancient records call the Devourers. The holographic display showed entities that made the mysterious ship destroying Council colonies look almost benign by comparison. The Devourers appeared as swarms of vessels that consumed everything in their path and converted matter and energy into more of themselves. It's an exponential expansion that could strip entire solar systems bare within days. They moved through space like locusts through grain fields and left behind only empty void where stars and planets and civilizations had once existed. The war lasted for centuries, according to what we can translate from The fragmentary records Okonkwo continued as images showed the Sentinel fighting alongside fleets from dozens of species that no longer existed. The Sentinel was not just Earth's protector, but rather a guardian for multiple systems, and it coordinated the defense against the Auras, while human engineers and scientists worked with other species to develop weapons that might stop an enemy that seemed unstoppable. The Sara moved closer to the holographic display, and her telepathic senses focused on the images as if she could read meaning from light and data. The other species in these recordings, the Mindari said slowly. I recognize some of the architectural styles and cultural symbols from ancient ruins that Council archaeologists discovered on dead worlds in the galactic core regions, and we always assumed those civilizations destroyed themselves through war or environmental collapse, but you are suggesting they fell to this external threat. Okonkwo nodded and advanced to the final. A set of recovered images which showed the Sentinel departing from Earth. While humans watched from their dying cities, the war reached a critical point where the Devourers had pushed through every defensive line and were approaching the core worlds, including Earth. Okonkwo explained. The Sentinel made a choice to lead a final desperate attack that would draw the Devourers' swarm away from protected space and into the dark regions beyond mapped territory. The images showed what happened next, with a clarity that made several observers turn away. The Sentinel and what remained of the Allied fleets engaged the Devourers in a battle that lasted years rather than ours, and the conflict moved farther and farther from civilized space as the Guardian deliberately retreated while fighting to keep the enemy focused on pursuing it rather than returning to consume the core worlds. The Sentinel's strategy worked, Okonkwo said, and his voice carried the weight of tragedy. The Devourers followed it into the dark, and the attacks on Earth and the other protected systems stopped. But the cost was catastrophic, the final images showed. Earth in the aftermath of the Sentinel's departure, and what they revealed, explained the silence in ways that made human history suddenly comprehensible without the Sentinel's protection and knowledge. Earth's advanced civilization collapsed within generations. Technology that humanity had developed with the Guardian's guidance required maintenance and understanding that humans had never fully grasped because they had always relied on the Sentinel to handle the most complex systems. Power grids failed when exotic energy sources depleted and no one knew how to replenish them. Transportation networks stopped functioning when the quantum calculations needed to maintain them became too difficult for human computers to process. Medicine reverted to primitive practices when advanced treatments required materials that could only be synthesized using methods the Sentinel had never fully explained. Within a century, Earth's population had crashed from billions to millions, and the survivors forgot almost everything about the civilization that had come before, as they struggled simply to grow food and build shelter and pass on stories that became myths about a guardian who had left them to face the darkness alone. The silence was not our failure, Okonkwo said, and his words carried an edge of defiance. It was the price we paid for the Sentinels. Sacrifice and humanity survived by rebuilding from nothing and learning self-reliance because we had no choice, and perhaps that is why the Council's offer of supervised development felt like an insult rather than assistance. Kroloth had remained silent throughout the presentation, but now the War Prime spoke, and his voice carried a respect that he had never shown humans before. The Sentinel was presumed destroyed in the war against the Devourers. Kroloth said, every military academy in Council space studies the battle records recovered from dead worlds, and the conclusion is always that nothing could have survived the conflict that burned across those sectors. Chen stepped forward, and her expression showed that she had already reached the conclusion that was about to change everything. The entity destroying your colonies is not an enemy, Chen said quietly. It is the Sentinel, and it survived the war, but became lost in the dark between stars, and now it is finally found its way back, and it is searching for Earth because that was its home, and we were its wards, and it does not understand why we are not where it left us. The chamber fell silent as everyone processed the implications, and then Velshan spoke with a tone that mixed awe and terror. If the Sentinel has returned, then it believes the Devourers may have returned as well. The High Arbiter said no Guardian abandons its post unless the threat has been eliminated, and if it is searching for its wards with such desperation, then it must believe that the ancient enemy has followed it back from the dark. The Sentinel arrived at the edge of Sol System on a Tuesday morning, and every sensor, within 3 light years, detected its presence. Simultaneously, as if the Guardian wanted there to be no doubt about where it had finally found what it had been searching for across millennia of darkness, the ship that had destroyed Kroloth battle fleets and shattered Council colonies appeared even more massive this close to Earth's sun, and its black hull seemed to drink light from the star itself, while structures that defied conventional geometry shifted across its surface, like thoughts made solid. Admiral Martinez commanded Earth's defense fleet from the battlecruiser Valiant, and she watched her tactical displays light up with warnings as ships from a dozen Council species converged on Sol System with weapons charged and shields at maximum, because no one knew whether the Sentinel would recognize Earth or simply consume it like it had consumed the colonies that got in its way. All ships report ready status, Martinez said into the fleet channel, and her voice remained calm despite the fact that her entire career had been spent defending humanity against hypothetical threats, and now she faced something that made every simulation and training exercise look like children playing at war. The Council fleet took up positions between Earth and the Sentinel in what Velshan claimed was a protective formation, but Martinez suspected was really an attempt to control first contact between humanity and the Guardian that had once protected them. Ambassador Chen stood on the bridge of the Valiant beside Martinez and watched the displays with an expression that mixed hope and terror, because everything depended on whether the Sentinel remembered Earth after 10,000 years of separation. "The Council fleet is hailing us," the communications officer reported. "High Arbiter Velshan is requesting that all human ships stand down and allow Council forces to manage the initial contact." Martinez looked at Chen and raised an eyebrow in a silent question about how to respond to what was clearly an attempt to maintain control over a situation that belonged to Earth alone. Chen activated her own communication channel and broadcast on all frequencies that both human and Council ships would receive. "High Arbiter Velshan, this is Ambassador Sarah Chin, speaking on behalf of Earth and humanity," Chin said, and her voice carried absolute authority. "We appreciate it. The Council's presence, but first contact with the Sentinel, is a human matter, and we ask that all Council vessels maintain their current positions and allow Earth ships to approach the Guardian." Velshan's response came immediately, and his crystalline voice carried frustration that he could no longer hide behind diplomatic courtesy. "Ambassador Chen, the entity approaching your system has destroyed multiple colonies and killed thousands of Council citizens," Velshan transmitted. "The Council cannot allow Earth to approach an obvious threat without proper security protocols in place." Chen's expression hardened, and Martinez saw the ambassador transform from someone who had spent years accepting condescension into someone who would not tolerate interference in Earth's most important moment. "The Sentinel is not a threat to Earth," Chen said, and her words cut through every objection. "It is our Guardian returning home after fighting a war that saved this galaxy from extinction, and if the Council attempts to interfere with our reunion, then humanity will consider it an act of aggression against our sovereignty." The communication channel fell silent as Velshan processed the reality that humanity had just threatened the entire Galactic Council and meant every word. Kroll's voice broke the silence with what might have been laughter. "If the War Prime species had possessed a sense of humor, the humans have grown bold." Kraloth transmitted, and his tone carried approval rather than anger. "Very well, Ambassador Chen. The Council fleet will observe while Earth approaches its Guardian, but know that our weapons remain active in case your reunion does not proceed as you hope." Martinez gave the order in Earth's defense. Fleet began moving toward the Sentinel, with the Valiant in the lead, because if humanity was going to bet everything on the Guardian recognizing them, then the Fleet Admiral would be the first to face whatever came. Axtas. The human ships approached. The Sentinel began broadcasting, and the message came in the same ancient Earth language that Dr. Okonkwo had translated from the Antarctic archive. "Speaker, on every ship I have slept in the darkness between galaxies while my wounds healed, and my purpose remained clear even when my awareness faded." The Guardian ship began to change, and the black hole rippled like liquid as structures rearranged themselves into patterns that seemed almost familiar, as if the Sentinel was trying to remember what form it had taken when it last stood among humans. I have returned to find my wards absent, and my protected systems occupied by those who do not. Remember the ancient pacts, the voice continued. Where is Earth, and where are the humans who gave me purpose when I was alone and gave me home when... Ah! I had none. Chen activated the Valiant's transmission array and spoke in modern English, knowing that the Sentinel's translation systems would bridge 10,000 years of linguistic evolution. Guardian, we are here, Chen said, and her voice carried across the void between ships. We are the children of the humans you protected, and we have survived. The silence that fell after you departed, and we have rebuilt our civilization, and we have waited for your return even when we did not know if you still existed. Sentinel's ship stopped moving, and for a moment that stretched into eternity, nothing happened while the Guardian processed information that contradicted what it expected to find. Then the massive vessel began to shift again, and this time, changes were dramatic as the black hull opened to reveal internal structures that glowed with the same light that ancient recordings showed emanating from the Guardian when it walked among humans. A form began to emerge from the ship, and it was not the geometric pattern or the humanoid figure that the archive images had shown, but instead, something that combined elements of both, as if the Sentinel was creating a new manifestation specifically for this reunion. The entity that appeared before the human fleet stood 300 meters tall and was composed of energy and matter woven together in patterns that human sensors could not fully resolve, but which created an overall impression of someone who had been gone for too long and was finally home. You are smaller than I remember, the Sentinel said, and its voice no longer came from the ship, but from the manifestation itself. You are different in form and language and technology, but I feel that connection that bound us before the war, and I know that you are the descendants of those. I protected the Guardian's manifestation. Reached toward the Valiant with what might have been a hand, or might have been a stream of energy, or might have been something that existed in dimensions where human perception could not follow. I left you to fight the Devourers, the Sentinel continued, and for the first time its voice carried emotion that translated clearly as sorrow. I drew them into the dark, and I battled them across voids where stars do not shine, and I believed. I had destroyed them all, but I was wounded, and I drifted for ages uncounted while my systems repaired and my memories fractured. Martinez ordered the Valiant to hold position as the Guardian's energy touched the ship's hull and ran across its surface like fingers remembering the texture of something precious. When I finally woke, I found the galaxy changed beyond recognition.
Oh.
The Sentinel said the species I remembered were gone, and new civilizations occupied what had been protected space, and I could not find Earth among the systems I once knew, because your star's position had shifted and your transmissions used frequencies. I did not expect. Chen felt tears on her cheeks, but her voice remained steady as she responded to the Guardian that had sacrificed everything to protect humanity, only to return and find its wards scattered across a galaxy that had forgotten the ancient war. We survived because of what you taught us. Chen said, we fell into darkness when you left, but we climbed back into the light because you had shown us that knowledge and cooperation and determination could overcome any challenge. The Sentinel's manifestation pulsed with colors that might have been the equivalent of tears for an entity that was partly machine and partly something else. "Am home," the Guardian said simply, "but I have returned because the Devourers have returned as well." The pronouncement fell across the fleet like a physical weight, and Martinez saw her tactical officers exchange glances that confirmed what everyone had feared since Dr. Okonkwo showed them the ancient recordings. "The enemy I fought in the dark was not completely destroyed," the Sentinel continued. "I wounded them badly enough that they retreated to rebuild their numbers, but they followed me. When I finally navigated back to known space, and they are coming here with forces that dwarf what I faced 10,000 years ago." Velshan's transmission interrupted from where the Council fleet maintained its observation position. "Guardian, the Galactic Council requests an audience to discuss defensive preparations against this threat," the High Arbiter said, and even through the crystalline harmonics, his voice carried desperation. The Sentinel turned its attention toward the Council fleet, and the movement felt like the focus of a star's worth of energy, concentrating on something small and fragile. The Devourers arrived 6 weeks after the Sentinels returned to Earth, and their emergence into normal space created gravitational distortions that were detected by sensors across 3 sectors as reality itself bent under the weight of their numbers. Commander Martinez stood in the war room deep beneath the surface of Luna, where Earth's military leadership had gathered alongside Council representatives who had spent the past month learning to take orders from a species they had dismissed as primitive. Holographic display showed the enemy fleet spreading across space like a living nightmare, and every analyst who studied the formations came to the same conclusion that no one wanted to speak aloud. There were too many. The Devourers had sent 10,000 ships to test the galaxy's defenses, and each vessel was larger than anything the Council had ever built and carried weapons that could crack planets and harvest the debris. To build more ships in an exponential expansion that would not stop until everything was consumed. The Sentinel's long-range scans confirm what we are seeing, Admiral. Zhang reported from her position coordinating the defense fleet. The enemy is advancing on a broad front that will hit 17 major systems simultaneously, and they are using the same tactics they employed 10,000 years ago, where they overwhelm defenders with numbers before anyone can mount an effective response. Velshan stood beside Ambassador Chen, and the High Arbiter's crystalline form pulsed with colors that indicated he was still struggling to accept that humanity now commanded the galactic defense instead of merely contributing to it. The Council's combined fleet numbers 4,000 ships, Velshan said, and his voice carried the weight of someone calculating odds that did not favor survival. Even with Earth's contributions and the Sentinel's capabilities, we are outnumbered more than 2 to 1 by an enemy that our ancestors could not defeat when they had greater numbers and more advanced technology. Chen studied the holographic display and watched red markers representing Devourer ships spreading across the map like infection, while blue markers showing Allied forces seemed pitifully small by comparison. Dr. Okonkwo, what did the ancient records say about how the Sentinel fought that Devourers? During the First War, Chen asked and turned to where the archaeologist was reviewing data recovered from sites. Cross-Earth Okonkwo manipulated his tablet and brought up translations that he had been working on continuously since the Guardian's return. The Sentinel did not fight the Devourers ship to ship, Okonkwo explained. Instead, it used what the records call resonance warfare, where it would bond with volunteers from multiple species and create a network of enhanced vessels that could operate in perfect coordination. We brought up images from the archive showing human pilots merged with technology that made their ships extensions of the Sentinel's consciousness while maintaining individual decision-making and tactical creativity. The Guardian would share its ability to manipulate space-time and matter energy conversion with the bonded pilots, Okonkwo continued, and those pilots would become force multipliers who could each face dozens of Devourer ships because they operated with perfect coordination and had access to weapons that normal vessels could not power. Kraloth leaned forward and studied the images with the intense focus of someone who had spent his entire life preparing for war. Your ancestors fought alongside the Sentinel as equals rather than as protected children, the War Prime said, and his voice carried respect that he had never shown humans before. They risked bonding with an entity that could have consumed their minds, and instead became something greater than either species alone could achieve. Chen felt the weight of that history pressing down on her shoulders because she knew what Okonkwo was suggesting without saying it directly. The Sentinel is offering to bond with human pilots again, Chen said, and made it a statement rather than a question. Martinez nodded and activated a communication channel that connected to the Guardians ship orbiting Earth at the heart of the defense fleet. The Sentinel has been broadcasting requests for volunteers since it finished analyzing the Devourer formations. Martinez said it needs at least 100 bonded pilots to create an effective resonance network, but it refuses to force anyone to accept the bond. And it warns that the process is dangerous and some volunteers may not survive the integration. This Ara spoke up from where the Mindery telepath had been monitoring the psychic resonance patterns emanating from the Guardian's presence. I've been sensing the Sentinel's emotional state since it arrived, Sarah said, and her musical voice carried unusual gentleness. It grieves every volunteer who comes forward because it remembers those who died during the First War, and it does not wish to ask humans to sacrifice themselves again. Chen walked to the window that looked out over Luna's surface, where she could see Earth hanging in the black sky like a blue jewel. That the galaxy had spent 3 centuries dismissing is insignificant. How many volunteers have come forward? Chen asked quietly. 12,000? Martinez answered. We have 12,000 pilots requesting permission to bond with the Sentinel, and that number increases every hour as more people learn what is being asked. The war room fell silent as everyone processed the reality that humanity was offering to send 12,000 of its people into a bonding process that might kill them. In order to protect a galaxy that had never shown them respect, Velshines, crystalline form shifted through colors that Chen had learned to interpret as shame and gratitude mixing together. Why, the High Arbiter asked, and his voice carried genuine confusion. Why would humans volunteer to risk death protecting Council species who treated you as inferior and who only acknowledged your value when we needed something from you? Chen turned away from the window and faced the Council representatives, who had gathered in Earth's war room to watch humanity decide the galaxy's fate, because we remember what it feels like to face darkness alone, Chen said simply, and because we choose to be better than those who dismissed us, and because the Sentinel taught our ancestors that true strength comes from protecting others even when they do not deserve it. She paused and met Velshan's gaze with absolute conviction. But mostly because this is our home, to Chen continued, the galaxy belongs to all of us, and we will not abandon it to be consumed by an enemy that our guardian fought for 10,000 years to keep away. Martinez activated the fleet-wide channel, and her voice carried to every ship in the defense network, all volunteer pilots. Report to integration chambers, Martinez ordered. The Sentinel will begin bonding procedures immediately, and may whatever gods you believe in watch over those who step forward over the next 12 hours. Chen watched as human volunteers entered integration chambers aboard the Sentinel ship and emerged transformed into something that was both more and less than human. The bonded pilots retained their personalities and memories and individual creativity, but they now operated with a connection to the Sentinel that allowed them to sense its thoughts and share its power and coordinate with other bonded pilots as if they were parts of a single organism. Their ships changed too, as the Guardian's technology merged with human vessels and created hybrid craft that looked like someone had taken Earth's sleek military designs and woven them together with the same black material and impossible geometry that made up the Sentinel's whole. 100 volunteers completed the bonding successfully, while 3 died during integration, and the Sentinel mourned each loss with a grief that resonated through every bonded pilot's consciousness. Visited the medical bay where the bonded pilots were recovering, and she found Lieutenant Sarah Kim sitting up in bed while doctors monitored readings that fluctuated between human normal and something entirely different. How do you feel? Chen asked, and studied the young pilot, who had volunteered despite knowing the risks. Kim smiled, in her eyes reflected light and patterns that had not been there before the bonding. I feel like I can sense the fabric of space itself, Kim said, and her voice carried harmonics that made Chen think of the Sentinel's transmissions. I know where every ship in the fleet is positioned, and I can feel the Devourers approaching like pressure against my mind, and I understand what the Guardian has been carrying for all these years. She paused and tears ran down her cheeks. It is so lonely, Kim whispered. The Sentinel has been alone for 10,000 years, fighting and searching and hoping. And now it finally has others who can share the burden Chen took. Kim's hand and felt energy flowing beneath the pilot's skin like currents of electricity following paths that human biology had never included. Can you win? Chen asked, because she needed to know if humanity's sacrifice would be enough. Kim's expression hardened into determination that mixed human stubbornness with something vast and ancient. We can try, Kim said, and trying is all the Sentinel has ever asked of us. The Devourers hit the outer defense perimeter 2 days later, and the galaxy learned what happened when humanity decided to stop being dismissed and started being dangerous. Bonded pilots flew their hybrid ships in formations that no conventional fleet could match and moved through space with coordination that made individual vessels irrelevant because T.